Captain Melissa Turner had exactly 90 seconds to decide whether she was about to become a pilot or a witness. The C-130's hydraulic hum filled the cockpit the way it had for the last 2 hours. Steady, unremarkable. The sound of a routine humanitarian flight carrying 18 wounded patients toward a hospital that couldn't come fast enough. She wasn't supposed to be sitting this close to the controls. She wasn't even supposed to be on this aircraft type at all. 11 years flying Blackhawks had taught her rotors, not runways. Helicopters, not this. Then Lieutenant Colonel Hal Reyes stopped talking mid-sentence. His hand slid off the yoke first. Then his head dropped, chin against his chest, and the aircraft dipped sideways in the sudden absence of the man who'd flown it 11 times before without incident. Beside him, First Lieutenant Danny Osei grabbed for the controls with one hand and his aircraft commander's shoulder with the other, his voice climbing toward something close to panic. In the back, a flight nurse was already moving between litters that held 2 wounded soldiers and 16 civilians, too weak to understand yet that something had gone wrong at the front of the plane. Melissa didn't have a type rating on this aircraft. She'd never touched this panel, never trained on these systems, never expected to need to. What she had was 11 years of knowing how to stay calm when an aircraft needed her hands more than it needed her confidence. "Turner." Osei's voice cracked with something raw and desperate. "I need you in that seat." She looked at the empty chair beside him, then at the storm building on the radar ahead of them, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that there was no version of the next hour where she got to stay a passenger. The cargo hold of the C-130 smelled like diesel and antiseptic, a combination Captain Melissa Turner had learned to associate with missions that mattered. She sat in the jump seat just behind the flight deck, head set loose around her neck, watching the back of 2 pilots she'd known for exactly 6 days. 6 days. That was how long she'd been attached to the 74th Airlift Squadron, ever since her own unit's Blackhawks got grounded for a parts shortage nobody could explain, and somebody at battalion decided her flight hours shouldn't go to waste. So here she was, technically a liaison officer, technically just an observer, riding along on a humanitarian run to document joint service coordination for a report that maybe 6 people would ever read. Below them, the terrain had gone from green to brown, to the kind of cracked earth that meant the flood relief zone was close. In the back, 18 litters held patients from a field hospital that had run out of supplies 4 days ago. Dehydration, infected wounds, 2 soldiers who'd been hurt clearing debris from a collapsed bridge. A flight nurse named Delgado moved between them with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Melissa liked the feel of a good crew. She could hear it in the rhythm of the flight deck. The aircraft commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Reyes, running through frequency changes with the co-pilot, First Lieutenant Danny Osei, their voices low and unhurried. Reyes had flown this exact route 11 times, he'd told her over coffee that morning, and every one of those flights had ended the same way. Wheels down, patients transferred, home in time for a real meal. "Turner, you want to see something?" Reyes said over his shoulder, not looking back. "Weather radar's showing a system building west of the Strip. Nothing bad, just enough to make Osei nervous." "I heard that," Osei said. Melissa smiled and leaned forward slightly, watching the green sweep of the radar display. She didn't know this aircraft, had never sat at these controls, never trained on this panel, never needed to. Her world was rotors and hoverholds, and threading a helicopter into spaces barely wider than its blades. But she understood instruments, understood the language of altitude and airspeed and rate of descent, and she found herself doing what she always did on someone else's flight deck, quietly following along, translating everything into terms she knew. "You logged transport time before?" Reyes asked. "Some, years ago. Nothing like this bird. Everybody says that the first time. Then they fall in love." He said it lightly, the kind of thing pilots said to fill space, and Melissa laughed because it was easier than explaining that she already loved something else, something smaller and faster and closer to the ground. Osei read off a fuel figure. Reyes acknowledged it. The plane hummed along at altitude, steady, unremarkable, the kind of flight that made for a boring line in a logbook and nothing else. Melissa found her mind drifting to the report she still hadn't started. The questions she was supposed to be answering about inter-service logistics, and how none of it seemed as real as the sound of Delgado's voice, checking on a patient 2 rows back. "Hey, Turner," Reyes said. "Come up here a second. Want your eyes on something." She unclipped from the jump seat and moved forward, bracing a hand against the bulkhead as the aircraft shifted gently in a pocket of turbulence. Reyes gestured at a gauge on the overhead panel, something about hydraulic pressure trending a half-point outside normal. "Probably nothing," he said, but he liked a second set of eyes on anything that looked even slightly off. Melissa leaned in to look. Reyes didn't finish his sentence. She heard it before she understood it. A change in his breathing, short and wrong, followed by a sound that wasn't a word at all. When she turned, his head had dropped forward against his chest, chin tucked, hands sliding off the yoke like something had simply switched off inside him. "Hal?" Osei's voice cracked upward, the practiced calm gone in an instant. He grabbed for the controls with one hand while trying to reach across to his aircraft commander with the other, and the plane wallowed sideways as his attention split in 2 directions at once. "Hal! Hey! Hal!" Melissa was already moving, catching Reyes's shoulder before he could slump fully into the controls, easing him back against his harness. His eyes were half open, unfocused, his breathing shallow and uneven. Not gone, but not present either. "Get Delgado up here," she said, and was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Now." Osei's hands were full. The aircraft, the radio, the man beside him who had trained him, mentored him, flown him through 6 years of missions just like this one. And for one terrible second, Melissa watched him understand, all at once, that he could not do all 3. "Turner?" His voice had dropped to something quieter and far more frightened than the situation should have allowed for a trained Air Force pilot. "I need you in that seat." For a moment, Melissa didn't move, and in that moment she ran through every reason why this was a mistake. She had 11 years of Army aviation behind her, 4 combat deployments, more flight hours in a Black Hawk than most pilots twice her age. She had landed in dust storms that turned the world the color of rust, had put a helicopter down on a rooftop with rotor clearance she still didn't like to think about, had once flown a wounded gunner 60 miles with a fuel gauge that lied to her the whole way. She trusted her hands. She trusted her instincts. None of that meant she knew how to fly a C-130. "Osei, I'm a rotor head," she said. "I've never touched a transport panel like this one." "I know." He didn't look at her. His hands were locked on the yoke, correcting a drift that Reyes's slumping weight had put into the controls. Behind them, she heard Delgado's boots hitting the deck at a run, heard the nurse's voice go from startled to clinical in the space of 2 breaths. "Pulse is weak, pupils uneven. Get me a medical kit. Somebody help me get him flat. I know you haven't flown this bird, but I can't split myself 3 ways, and I need someone in that seat who understands what altitude means and what airspeed means and can read a gauge without me explaining it first. That's more than nothing. Right now, that's everything I've got." She thought of her mother, a woman who'd spent 30 years as an ER nurse and had a saying for moments like this. "You don't have to be the best person in the room. You just have to be a person who shows up." Melissa had never much liked the saying. It felt like an excuse dressed up as wisdom. But she understood it now in a way she hadn't before, sliding into the right seat while Delgado and a second medic eased Reyes back into the narrow space behind the flight deck, laying him as flat as the cramped area allowed. The panel in front of her was familiar and foreign at once. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, artificial horizon, all instruments she'd read 1,000 times, arranged in a layout that belonged to an aircraft 4 times heavier than anything she'd ever commanded. 4 throttles instead of 1 collective. A yoke instead of a cyclic stick. Rudder pedals that controlled something entirely different from what her feet expected. "Talk to me," she said. "Simple. What do I need to know before anything else?" Trims roughly set for level flight. Don't touch it unless I tell you. Hands light on the yoke. This isn't your helicopter. It doesn't want to be muscled. It wants to be nudged. Osei's voice had steadied, the way voices sometimes did when a person found a task simple enough to hold on to. Airspeed's good. Altitude's good. Right now the aircraft is basically flying itself. Your job is just to help me keep it that way while I get us talking to someone who can actually walk us through a landing. How's Reyes? Delgado's voice came from behind them, tight and focused. Breathing's shallow. Could be cardiac, could be a stroke. I won't know for certain until I can run more than a field exam. He needs a hospital faster than he needed to be flying this plane. Melissa felt the weight of that sentence settle into her chest, sharp and immediate. It meant the flight wasn't just a problem to be solved carefully. It was a clock running down on two fronts at once. The patients in the back, who'd already waited too long for proper care, and now the man who'd flown them halfway across a continent to get it. Osei kicked the radio to the emergency frequency, and Melissa listened to him lay out the situation in the clipped, procedural language pilots used when panic wasn't an option. Aircraft commander incapacitated, co-pilot flying, additional pilot in right seat without type qualification on this aircraft. Request immediate assistance. There was a pause on the other end that felt longer than it probably was. Then a new voice, older, unhurried in a way that suggested decades of practice staying calm on a radio. Copy that, 4-2 Tango. This is approach control. Stand by. We're pulling in everyone we've got who's flown a Hercules. Melissa gripped the yoke lightly, the way Osei had told her to, and watched the horizon line stay level and unbothered outside the windscreen, indifferent to the fact that the two people now flying the aircraft beneath it had, between them, exactly one qualified set of hands. How long till we need to start descending? She asked. Osei checked a chart, did quick math in his head. 40 minutes, maybe less if that weather system keeps building. 40 minutes to become, at least well enough to survive it, a pilot she had never been. The voice that finally came through the headset didn't belong to a controller. It belonged to an old man. 4-2 Tango, this is Frank Halloran. I flew Hercules transports for 26 years, retired now, sitting in my kitchen in Ohio with a cup of coffee going cold. They tell me you've got a situation. Something in Melissa's chest loosened slightly at the sound of him. Not youth, not urgency. Just a voice that had clearly talked pilots through worse than this before. This is Captain Melissa Turner, sir. I'm Army Aviation Rotary Wing. I'm in the right seat of an aircraft I've never flown, helping a co-pilot who's never had to fly one alone. Well, a pause, a sound like a mug being set down. That's about as honest an introduction as I've ever heard. All right, let's get to know each other before this gets hard. He walked her through the panel the way a patient teacher walks a student through an unfamiliar language. Not by translating every word, but by pointing out the ones that mattered most right now. Power settings, flap indicators, the rhythm of a stabilized approach. Every few minutes he'd stop and ask her to read something back to him, not because he doubted her, he said, but because saying a thing out loud made it stick better than hearing it. A second voice joined partway through. Another retired instructor, a woman named Carol Vance, who'd trained new pilots on this exact aircraft in the 90s, patched in from somewhere with better signal than Halloran's kitchen. Between the two of them, they built something like a bridge across 30 years of changed avionics, occasionally disagreeing about a system that had been upgraded since either of them last sat in a cockpit. That warning panel you're describing, Vance said at one point. We didn't have that in my day. Danny, is that new since the last overhaul? Added 2 years ago, Osei said. It's just a caution light, not a fault. I'll walk her through it later. Good. Then let's not borrow trouble we don't have yet. Melissa appreciated her for saying it. There was a comfort in people who knew the difference between a real problem and a distraction. But comfort didn't stop the weather. Osei broke the rhythm of the lesson to point out the radar display, where the green returns Reyes had mentioned so casually an hour ago had thickened into something with real teeth. A storm cell building directly over Ketlow Field, the nearest usable runway. Close enough now that avoiding it would mean either waiting it out or flying somewhere else entirely. "There's a second field," Osei said. "Bragston. 60 miles farther, clear skies, longer runway, better everything. If this were any other flight, that's where I'd take us without a second thought." Melissa understood immediately what he wasn't saying. But it's 60 miles farther for people who might not have 60 extra miles in them. "Delgado," Osei called back. "Give it to us straight." The nurse appeared in the narrow space between the seats, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been making triage decisions for hours before the flight had even become a crisis. "Colonel Reyes needs a hospital as soon as this aircraft is on the ground, full stop. I've got 2 patients in the back I'm watching closely. A soldier with a wound that's showing early signs of infection response, and a woman with dehydration bad enough that her vitals are trending the wrong direction. 60 extra miles isn't going to kill anybody today, but it's not nothing either. I'd rather not test how much it isn't nothing." Melissa felt the decision take shape in her chest before she'd fully worked it out in words. The same way she used to feel it in the cockpit of her Black Hawk, when the right answer arrived not through calculation, but through the accumulated weight of every similar decision she'd made before. This wasn't about finding the easy answer. There wasn't one. It was about weighing 2 real risks against each other and choosing the one she could live with. "Ketlow," she said. "We go for the closer field." "That storm's not going to be polite about it," Osei said, not arguing, just making sure she'd heard herself say it. "I know. But I'd rather fight weather with 2 experienced people talking me through it than fly an extra hour with patients getting worse and Reyes getting worse, and nothing to show for the distance except more time for things to go wrong." She looked at him. "Your call, too. You're the one actually rated on this aircraft." Osei was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the darkening smear of cloud ahead of them. Then he nodded, short and certain. "Ketlow. Let's get it done before that system finishes building." Back in the cabin, Melissa could hear it now. The murmur of voices where before there had been the ordinary white noise of an uneventful flight. Someone had noticed the change in the cockpit's tension, the way passengers always seemed to sense trouble before anyone told them outright. A young corporal with his arm in a sling had unbuckled enough to lean toward the flight deck door, asking Delgado's assistant nurse in a low voice if everything was all right. Melissa didn't have an answer for him yet. She had a heading, a plan, and 2 voices on the radio who believed she could learn a lifetime of experience in the space of 30 more minutes. That would have to be enough. The storm announced itself first as a change in light, the flat gray glare of an overcast sky deepening into something closer to bruised purple along the horizon. Then came the turbulence. Small at first, a shudder through the airframe that made the loose items in the cockpit rattle against their moorings. "Ketlow approach, 42 Tango, requesting vectors," Osei said, and a new voice answered, a controller on the ground now guiding them toward the runway, even as Halloran and Vance stayed on a second frequency, still walking Melissa through the unfamiliar rhythm of a landing checklist. "Flaps," Halloran said. "Danny'll call the setting. You'll move the lever when he says. This isn't a solo performance, Captain. It's the 2 of you, doing what you each do best." Melissa found something steadying in that. She wasn't being asked to become a transport pilot in 30 minutes. She was being asked to be a second set of capable hands attached to someone who knew this aircraft, and to trust that division of labor the same way she'd trusted a crew chief 100 times before. The same way she trusted Delgado now to keep 2 fragile patients alive in the back while she and Osei kept the aircraft in the air. "Flaps 10, Osei called. She moved the lever, felt the subtle shift in the aircraft's attitude as it responded, watched the indicator confirm the setting. Small, manageable. 1 step in a sequence, not the whole mountain at once. The rain hit without warning. First a scatter against the windscreen and then a hard, steady drumming that made the world outside the glass dissolve into gray streaks. The aircraft bucked once, hard enough that Melissa's hand tightened on the yoke before she caught herself and eased the grip, remembering what Osei had told her an hour ago. It doesn't want to be muscled. It wants to be nudged. Crosswinds picking up, the ground controller said. 15 knots, gusting to 22, runway heading 270. Copy, Osei said. His voice had gone flat and focused, the sound of a man narrowing his entire world down to the numbers in front of him. Turner, when I call for rudder correction, it's going to feel different than anything you're used to. Bigger aircraft, slower response. Don't chase it. Small inputs, then wait and see what the plane does before you add more. Small inputs, she repeated. Wait and see. A caution light flared amber on the overhead panel. The same one Vance had waved off earlier as nothing to worry about. Except now, on final approach, in weather, it demanded attention whether it was serious or not. Danny. Melissa kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to keep it level in 100 other cockpits during 100 other small emergencies, because a raised voice cost more than it ever bought. Amber light, hydraulic system 2. Osei's eyes flicked to it and back to the windscreen in under a second. That's the caution Vance mentioned. Not a fault, just flagging reduced redundancy. We've still got full control through System 1. Note it, don't chase it. Everything's still answering the way it should. Copy. On the radio, Halloran's voice came through steady as ever, unbothered by weather he couldn't see and couldn't do anything about except trust the two people flying through it. You're doing the job, Captain. I want you thinking about this the same way you'd think about setting a helicopter down in a tight space with wind pushing at you. You've done that. This isn't so different underneath all the extra metal. It wasn't, she realized. Not really. The instruments were different. The scale was different. The margin for error was different. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. But the underlying task was the one she'd spent 11 years learning. Read the aircraft, read the weather, read the moment, and make small, honest corrections instead of big, desperate ones. The runway came into view through a break in the rain, a gray stripe against grayer ground, closer and more real than any instrument reading had made it feel. Runway in sight, Osei said. Confirmed. Gear down. Melissa reached for the lever, felt the reassuring thunk and whine of the landing gear extending, watched 3 green lights confirm what her hands already believed. The crosswind shoved at the aircraft in a hard, sustained gust, and she felt Osei correct for it with the confidence of someone who'd done this exact maneuver dozens of times, his hands steady even as the whole airframe seemed to shudder in protest. With me on the yoke, he said. Light touch. We're bringing it down together. The last 100 feet passed in a compressed, focused silence, broken only by Osei's calm call-outs and the controller's clipped confirmations. The wheels found the runway hard, harder than Melissa would have liked, a jolt that rattled through the airframe and up through her spine. But the aircraft stayed straight, stayed controlled, and the brakes caught with a solid, certain deceleration that felt, in that moment, like the single best sound she had ever heard. Down, Osei said, something raw and relieved cracking through the flatness of his voice. We're down. Melissa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since somewhere over Ketlow's outer marker, her hands still resting lightly on a yoke that no longer needed her grip at all. Behind them, she could already hear the shift in the cabin, Delgado's voice calling for the medical team waiting on the tarmac, the low murmur of relief moving through passengers who had felt every hard second of that landing without ever fully understanding what it had taken to survive it. Outside the windscreen, through rain still streaking the glass, she could see emergency vehicles already moving toward them, lights turning red and white against the gray afternoon. The aircraft had barely rolled to a stop before the doors opened and the tarmac filled with motion, medics moving in practiced formation toward the cargo ramp, a gurney crew ducking through the rain toward the flight deck where Reyes still lay, pale and unmoving but breathing, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, stubborn rhythm that Delgado had been tracking for the better part of an hour. Melissa unclipped her harness and found her hands were shaking, a delayed tremor that hadn't shown itself once during the entire descent. She sat for a moment, letting it pass, watching through the windscreen as the medical team lifted Reyes with careful, coordinated hands and carried him toward a waiting ambulance, Its doors already open, engine already running. "Hey." She looked over. Osei hadn't moved either, still strapped into his seat, staring out at the rain with the particular stillness of someone whose body hadn't caught up yet with the fact that the danger had passed. "You did that," he said. "I want you to hear me say it. You did that. We did it. I wouldn't have known where to start without you. And I couldn't have split myself between flying this aircraft and keeping Hal alive back there. You gave me a second set of hands I needed and didn't have." He managed something close to a smile, tired and real. "Halloran's still on the line, by the way. Wants to say something before we lose the connection." She picked up the headset she'd nearly forgotten she was still wearing. "Captain Turner. Figured you'd want to hear this while it's still fresh," Halloran said, his kitchen-quiet voice carrying easily now that the tension had drained out of the frequency. 30 years I spent teaching pilots to fly that aircraft, and most of them had months to learn what you just learned in under an hour. That's not luck, Captain. That's what happens when someone's already spent a career learning how to make good decisions fast. The airframe was just new. You weren't." She didn't have a response ready for that, and found she didn't need one. Vance's voice came through a moment later, brief and warm. "Good landing, good crew, go take care of your people." Before the frequency went quiet, the two retired instructors returning to whatever ordinary afternoon they'd stepped out of to talk a stranger down through a storm. Outside, Delgado was already coordinating the transfer of patients, her voice carrying across the tarmac with the same clipped authority she'd used the entire flight, as if nothing about the last 2 hours had been anything other than another difficult day at work. The young corporal who'd leaned toward the cockpit door earlier paused on his way down the ramp, catching Melissa's eye through the open hatch. "Was that you flying?" he asked. "Heard some of the crew talking. Said you weren't even supposed to be up there." "Wasn't supposed to be, no." She found she didn't mind the question, though she wasn't sure yet how to answer it honestly. "Lieutenant Osei flew the aircraft. I just helped him keep it steady." The corporal considered that, then nodded slowly, the way people did when they decided a story was more complicated than they had time to hear in full. "Well, however it happened, thanks." He moved on, and Melissa watched him go, then turned back to find Osei still sitting in the left seat, running a hand over his face in the particular way of someone processing an experience too large to fit into the moment it happened in. "You going to write this up?" she asked. "Have to. Incident report, medical emergency, unqualified pilot in the right seat. There's a whole stack of forms with my name on them by tonight." He glanced at her. "For what it's worth, I'm not going to write it up as anything other than what it was. A co-pilot who needed help, and a pilot who happened to be sitting close enough to give it." Melissa thought about her own report, the one she still hadn't started. The one about inter-service coordination that had felt so abstract that morning and now felt almost beside the point. She thought about 11 years of helicopters, tight landing zones, wounded soldiers, and how none of it had ever asked her to prove. And that's the story of Captain Melissa Turner, a pilot who never expected to fly that aircraft, and a co-pilot who never expected to fly it alone. If this story moved you, take a second to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about the women who serve, the split-second decisions they make, and the quiet courage that rarely gets told. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next one.